Are you here? And there's a couple different levels to this. One is, why are you here at this very church right now? 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. But then the larger question, the more existential question, if you will, why are you here? Fitting into that question that we've been reflecting during the season of Lent. If we recall, the first Sunday of Lent reflected that this is a season of renewal, a time to ask the question, who am I? What am I about? And does the life I live match that identity? Last week, using the search from our small groups in that first session, reflected on the question, what do you seek? Because this helps us to narrow in on that answer. What's our deepest desires? The longings that go beyond the surface of feelings to help us understand who we are. Related to that, to help us to understand that, is that question, why are you here? And the scripture are going to help us this week reflect on that in the big scheme of things, as well as that question, why are we here at the 9 o'clock Mass on a Sunday morning? We're going to discover that both of them are connected. We heard the Lord tell us in the first reading today, you shall not have other gods besides me. Well, at the time of the writing of Exodus, as we're aware, and even in Jesus' time, there were many gods that were out there. Each culture had their own. And each god had their own demands for worship and for sacrifice. Many gods had their own order of priests to lead that sacrifice. Well, I suspect we don't really find that in our world today like we did then, but I suspect we all understand that command, you shall have no other gods besides me, has a much deeper meaning or greater meaning or different meaning than the worship of divine beings, so those we've determined to be divine. We're being taught that God is foundational because in him we find our true identity. He's meant to help us find our identity and our purpose. He's meant to be our motivation. And when we're living with God as our foundation, our lives are filled with joy and peace and loving. But there's so many in our world, and at times even us gathered here today, where that's not the case. Where God, the one God, is not our foundation. Rather, he's been replaced. Perhaps by money, or food, or sex, or the internet, video games, sports, work, whatever. How often do these things get all of our attention in life? How often do they replace God in our life? How often do we treat God as a luxury, if we treat him at all? Oh, it'd be great if I just had that time, right? Obviously, you've made the time to be here this morning, but what about other times throughout the week, right? Oftentimes, we're so caught up in what we have to do and what we want to do or what we can control that God gets pushed to the side. And what happens? That longing remains and actually begins to ache deep within us. We wander aimlessly. We feel overwhelmed and anxious and even lost. And fundamentally, what has happened? We have replaced God with ourselves. The Lord tells us today to keep holy the Sabbath. That God created everything in 6 days and took that seventh day to rest. And so we're meant to keep the Sabbath as a holy day dedicated to God, an imitation of God. To take the day to rest. But also take that day to become mindful of the Lord in our lives. That he's not just a luxury, but is the foundation and is needed in our lives. When we hear that command to keep the Sabbath, the Sabbath doesn't mean an hour or 45 minutes. It means we take a day in thanksgiving to God and worship and praise of God. Don't worry, the masses are going to last for the entire day, right? But certainly Mass is a part of that. But then that holy day continues when we leave here today. The family dinners, the family drives or walks, or the family projects. I remember growing up sometimes, if it wasn't a drive to the beach or a big dinner with family coming over, we'd do things like in the fall, we'd rake the leaves as a family. Some things that had to be done. Okay, my parents raked the leaves and my brother and I played in the leaves, but you get the point. We do things as a family. We do things that help us appreciate goodness and truth and beauty, right? They become the priority on the day of the Sabbath. Not what we didn't get done during the week or what we have to do in the week ahead. Because those times of appreciation and gratitude remind us of who we are and what we're about. They help us to see where God is present. And when we lose our sense of the importance of the Sabbath, we lose our sense of who we are. And once again, we replace God with ourselves and our own priorities. With this, we lose our sense of understanding of our meaning and purpose in life. We lose our sense of who we are, what our identity is. So why are you here this morning on a Sunday morning? Well, hopefully to keep that Sabbath, right? Hopefully to help us refocus our priorities on who God is. But we're reminded in the gospel today that so often we can struggle with that, right? And oftentimes it's not immediate, it's a gradual over time that our focus shifts from Him to ourselves. That replacement of God with ourselves isn't always instantaneous. It happens in small increments. These money changers and traders that we hear about in the scriptures, they actually had a legitimate role to play in the temple. Hundreds and thousands of people would take pilgrimage to the temple to offer sacrifice to the Lord in thanksgiving. Sacrifice to the Lord as part of the Passover, right? Part of the forgiveness of sins. And traveling great distance, you wouldn't bring those animals of sacrifice with you. So when you got to the temple, they would have available for purchase your lambs, your doves, right? And you had people coming from different lands, and so they would have the exchange of currency that would take place. All of this was done to help those coming to the temple to worship God, to be able to offer sacrifice to the priests, to the Lord. And oftentimes, particularly some of the more wealthy pilgrims and travelers would have their servants with them who may not be of the Jewish faith, but the temple had a section where the non-Jewish people could gather for worship and prayer to the Lord as well. What's happening in the gospel here today is over time, the money changers and the traders discovered, hey, we can get a little bit more money out of all of this, right? So we start to sell a little bit more than what's needed for worship. And then, by the way, for the animals needed for worship, the prices get raised up a bit, right? The exchange rates, the interest gets raised up a little bit, so they can start to turn a little bit more of a profit. And making such a good profit, what happens is we need more room. We can't interfere with what's going on in the temple, so we take these outer areas here, and those areas of the temple that were meant to be dedicated for the non-Jewish people, for the worship of God, are replaced by the money changers and the traders. Over a period of time, the worship of God has taken a back seat. Over a period of time, those that were meant to help facilitate the worship of God have become an obstacle to the worship of God. They have lost sight of who they were and what they were about. It still happens in our world today. It happens in churches and parishes and parish groups, right? Fundraisers take over the worship of God. They become the focus. The praise and worship of God becomes less and less of a priority and pushed aside for those types of activities. It happens in our own life. We discover, hey, I can make some extra money. I can pay those extra bills. I can catch up on things, get a head start. Mass becomes less of an act of worship when it becomes a routine or a hobby. God becomes a crutch that we turn to when we need to be consoled or when we need something, and not the object of our praise and love. And once again, the more we lose sight of God and what we do here at this table, the more disconnected from God and from ourselves we become. And then we end up replacing God once again with ourselves. Replacing God with ourselves. Now we've come to the heart of the struggle of the Christian life. The heart of the struggle of the interior spiritual life. And the heart of many of our problems and many of the problems in the world today. Why are you here? What are you seeking? This time of renewal within the season of Lent, this time of extra prayer and fasting and almsgiving, isn't meant to make us feel better, but meant to challenge us and encourage us to renew on those fundamental questions. Because spending time reflecting on these questions isn't daydreaming or a waste of time. It's how we discover and accept and live the greatest truth that God is God and we are not.